Right about now, I'd like to introduce you to the next group of entertainers. It's our first time to ever work with them, and they're regular members of the Grand Ole Opry. What say let's make them welcome Decca recording artists Tom Paul and the Glaser Brothers. Hey!
Please don't talk about me when I'm gone, little baby.
Oh, I love the Glaser Brothers harmony. They had, family is hard to beat.
I only got to see them perform live maybe once or twice, and I'll never forget it. I mean, it was as good as anything you'd ever want to see.
Probably the finest trio that ever came to Nashville, I think. Oh, they just have such beautiful voices, all three of them.
We tried to sound better than they did, but it wasn't easy because they were family and we were not.
Boy, I remember how bright their eyes were, just bright-eyed and curly hair, especially Tom Paul. I just thought they were really cute. I told Tom Paul laughing one night, I said, man, when I saw y'all in Greenville that night, I thought y'all were a bunch of Mexicans because they had dark curly hair. They had those harmonies that would just swoop up and down. They were just so perfect.
And the Glaser Brothers, in my opinion, were right there with the Everly Brothers because that sibling harmony, it fits and it sounds so good. So they set the bar for the harmonies.
And they had it nailed down. They had their show, they knew what they were doing. It like popped from one song to the next, and it was funny and it was entertaining. And and they'd do these acrobatic kind of vocal things that were like a vocal version of Cirque du Soleil. It was like, are you kidding me?
Howdy, everybody, and welcome to the Grand Ole Opry Show. We're the Glaser Brothers, and this is good old Jim Glaser. Give him a big hand. He don't get too much money, just sings high. Sure does get high. This is good old Chuck Glaser over here. Give him a big hand. And I'm the great Tom Paul. You don't have to give me a big hand unless you want to.
In the history of country music, that's really where they have gotten their place, not just with their harmonies and stuff, but also what they did business-wise, all those different things which really kind of opened up avenues for artists that didn't exist, before then. So I hope that's where they'll be remembered. I think that's where the real contribution was, those two things.
The number of things that came through Tom, Paul, and Chuck and Jim's world that turned out to be meaningful, pretty amazing.
Their contribution was huge, really, if you think of it in terms of they were a main part of the driving force that changed the studio system. And they made a tremendous impact on the music business as we know it in Nashville today. They raised the bar and set it for a lot of people.
We are on the farm where the Glaser Brothers actually grew up. This is where my grandparents lived till they passed away.
It was a 1,200-acre farm that was part farmland and part sandhill, pasture land. And we primarily raised corn and crops and fed prime beef.
We had 450 acres of hayland, very hay. And when we first started putting that up, we mowed with horses. You talk about pulling 450 acres of hay with horses.
Spalding is a typical rural community, mainly agriculture supported, very religious, conservative. A lot of Germans on this side of town, north and west, and a lot of Irish on south and east.
Very small town, sit right in the middle of a farming community. I think population back then was 618 or something, very small. There were 6 children, 5 boys and 1 girl. Bob was the oldest boy, and then Eleanor, the only girl, and brother John, and then Tom Paul and Chuck, and then me.
We grew up, of course, during the Depression and the drought. And so it was a lot of sand and sandburrs. that time. And we didn't realize how poor we were because everybody was poor at the time.
Everybody had nothing. I mean, people had lost their jobs, lost their farms, lost everything.
And my folks worked very hard to support us. And when I think back at how hard they worked, I don't know how they did it.
Mama said it didn't rain one drop for one whole year in 1934. And that lasted for 5 or 6 years. The land just dried up.
Very hard on my dad because he had a fire once and then he had a tornado, and it was, I'd say it kind of almost broke him.
He had dug out a cellar under. It wasn't a basement, just a cellar. And my dad used to keep potatoes in there. So when the house burned down, we had about 1,000 bushels of roasted potatoes. Pigs ate good then, wouldn't it?
It's something when it happens it doesn't seem real, and afterwards you realize how much you've lost because you lose everything. He moved a house out from town, and that's the house that's there that's partially built, because then the tornado came through and wrecked it. And
Dad was a very strict man, but he wasn't a mean man. He punished you by verbally chastising you. And if he got really mad at you, he'd chastise you by not talking to you at all for days. Matter of fact, after the house burned down, he didn't talk to Mom for years.
Well, Dad used to play guitar, and his brother, Martin, played fiddle, and they played for barn dances and things around the area. Mom played a little self-taught piano. And Tom Paul just had this fire in him to play music.
it was Tom Paul's dream, always, as far back as I can remember.
I've really never quite known anyone like that had that much fire. I don't even know if I'd be in the music business had it not been for that drive of his.
I don't know if he wanted to be a famous entertainer as so much as he wanted to sing. He liked to sing, he liked to entertain, he liked to be up in front of a crowd. And Jim, too, although Jim was actually about 5 years younger than Tom Paul.
He roped me in to playing guitar to accompany him, or to second him, as we called it. When I was so small, I could only reach the bottom 3 strings on the guitar, and he used to step on my foot when it was time for me to change chords. I knew what chord to go to, I just didn't know when.
Chuck joined, and I can't remember, probably was about 12 years old. He became part of the group too, learned to play the guitar and sing with him, and the 3 voices together were just absolutely the most beautiful trio that I can remember. Their voices blended so very well.
I had met the Glazers. I think Tom and I were about 15 or 16. I made their acquaintance because there were very few people that sang country music back then. It was called hillbilly music back then. And we were the only hillbillies in the whole state, I guess.
He'd come over to the house. It was so great to have somebody our own age who was into country music. Country music was kind of looked down on in those days, and it was always great getting together with Joe because we all loved it and loved the guitar, and it was neat.
As a matter of fact, my dad ran the theater over there in North Loop, and I had the Glazers over for a show. They sat down, the 3 of them, and Louis, their father, announced the show behind the curtain. He would say, and now the Glaser Brothers will perform the Wildwood Flower. And then they'd and they'd finish, and then he'd say, now the Glaser Brothers will perform Weem Away. And then they'd way up low, a weem away, a weem away, away. And they had a good show, and they were good showmen even back then, real good-looking guys.
Dad was so influential in our lives, and buying us guitars and booking us in little shows, and kind of making sure that what we were doing was, we didn't wind up singing in a bar someplace, you know.
Dad was also musically talented, and so was Mom. And so they encouraged them to continue, and they had them on Arthur Godfrey's show, talent show, which they won.
When the Arthur Godfrey television show came to Nebraska, he's the one that contacted them and got us an audition, and we appeared on that show. And when Marty Robbins came to Grand Island, Nebraska, that would have been in 1957. We went to see his matinee, and that was rare because names like that didn't come to Nebraska then. And Dad just walked backstage and knocked on Marty's door and said, "I want you to listen to my boys sing." And Marty said, "Well, okay."
Daddy just fell in love with them. The harmonies were just incredible, which everybody knows that.
Marty said he would start a record label for us and take us on the road with him.
He kind of took them under his wing. I think he promised the dad that he would take care of them, make sure they stayed out of trouble. He probably did the best he could. You know?
Some of the places he worked were bars where you weren't allowed to be in if you were under 21. And I remember the owner of a particular club down in Alabama, I think it was, and this is where you worked up behind the stage and they had chicken wire in front of you to keep the bottles off you that people threw. And the manager came back and asked Marty how old I was, and he said I was 20, and he said he stays in that dressing room when he's not on stage. He was very adamant about that.
This land is your land, this land is...
Daddy actually signed them to a record contract in I think August of '57. And he had started a little label, Robbins Records. I know they were the first release. I think it was 5 Penny Nickel.
As I went walking that ribbon of highway.
He tried to call in a lot of favors with a lot of the industry people, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. There wasn't enough of a machinery there at the time for a small record label to work when you didn't have promotion, you didn't have distribution. That's two big strikes against you.
Those were such special times. Being on the road with Marty, he'd had hit records. It was an amazing thing.
They worked on White Sport Coat because that had the doo-wop kind of teen sound, you know, that was kind of prevalent then, and that's what he basically hired them for, to do that song. And of course he was doing some other songs too at that time were a little more pop oriented.
We were on the Arthur Godfrey show in the fall of '57, and we had already come to Nashville and made a record for Robbins Records, and then he booked us on Bandstand with him, with Dick Clark. Just an amazing thing. You can't imagine. One day on the farm feeding the chickens, next day on Bandstand or traveling with Marty.
I had heard the Glaser Brothers one night, and Joe Babcock was on with them, and they were talking about Joe was replacing Chuck while he was in the Army, and I heard somebody talking about it on WSM one night.
We recorded for Decca, I think, several singles and a couple of albums.
We did an album of folk music on the tail end of the folk craze, and we did a record aiming for the pop market.
And Marty, of course, was popular. He was just as big then as he ever was. I was with the Glaser Brothers for 2 years. Then Chuck came back, and the Glaser Brothers offered to keep me on if I wanted to. But I didn't feel like there would be much room for me there with the Glaser Brothers, so I stayed with Marty.
They wrote every bit as good a Western song, I think, as Daddy did, you know. Of course, Run and Gun, they wrote Run and Gun, and they wrote so many of Daddy's songs that they might not have been number ones, but they were definitely songs that people remember.
Jim sang tenor on El Paso, probably some of the greatest singing of all time. That soaring part, da, da, da.
I think it made the whole Western album concept possible because it was one of those type of creations that really needed the harmonies.
When that record of Marty's hit, then we were starting to be accused of copying Marty's sound, when really it was our sound to begin with. I really don't think Marty would have minded at all if we'd have stayed as a backing group to him forever. He didn't have our future as a group by then in his mind at all. It was naturally, his mind was on his own career. I didn't see that at the time. Tom Paul did. And he realized we had to leave Marty, and I don't think I'd have come to that conclusion. I'd probably still been singing background somewhere.
That always happens. You just with any group, any band, there's always that nagging thing in the back of your mind. Could I make it on my own?
If you know anything about Marty Robbins, you know for a fact that he stole Tom Paul's sound.
Because he was country as brown soap before the Glazers went to work for him.
I don't know. Marty would certainly not have admitted to it because Marty was his own man.
I know that was probably one of the things that kind of drove a wedge between Daddy and Tom, was the fact that Tom wanted to take credit for Daddy's career.
Yeah, one night we were working the Opry, we worked the 11 o'clock show, and Marty Robbins always closed the Opry with the 11:30 show. Well, we were closing out and walking off stage, and Marty grabbed Tom Paul by the collar and dragged him out to the microphone and said, now you're going to hear the real Marty Robbins. And the next thing I knew, Tom Paul, with his guitar still strapped to his back, was chasing him up the alley behind the Opry. I'm going to kill you, you SOB. And Johnny Russell closed the show.
I think there was some influence on both sides. Tom had a distinctive sound on his own, you know, that had a flavor of Daddy's voice in it. But Daddy used their harmonies to capitalize on a sound that he was looking for.
Well, he certainly didn't mind taking advantage of something that worked for him. El Paso was a #1 record.
When he connected with the Glazers, that just allowed him even more freedom to kind of vary the sound that he had.
I know a lot of you have been sitting out there thinking that we sing a lot of songs that sound a little bit like Marty Robbins. I know you think it even if you don't say it. But we're going to do a Marty Robbins song, and this ain't going to sound nothing like it. Well, I told Mary about it, told her about our great saying. Mary smiled and forgave me. Mary took me back again.
When we came to Nashville in the fall of '57 to record our first record for Marty, he took us to the Opry and we sat out front, and the Everly Brothers were on. I remember sitting down and looking up at them and realizing that there was this thing about charisma. There were singers, and then there were people with charisma. We started appearing on the Opry as regulars with Marty in 1958. We didn't actually sign with him until probably after we left Marty.
I came down about 3 months before Chuck and Jim did and toured with him, and I did the Opry and Ernest Tubbs Record Shop. Then in 1958 we started, and we were regulars on the Opry, and we did commercials and vocal backing when the Jordanaires were in the studio. And we did that for 15 years.
They were very popular when they were on the Opry, Grand Ole Opry. And people loved their harmony.
Being a Grand Ole Opry member meant that you got to be booked on some of the better shows because the Grand Ole Opry had a lot of clout in those days.
The Ryman is so small backstage, and not a lot of dressing rooms, and everybody stumbling all over each other. And it was a big family feel. It was really something special.
Well, I've known him for years. I used to hang out with him a lot long before I ever produced him, especially Tom Paul.
Jack is still one of the great eccentrics of Nashville, a fantastically talented guy who did things his own way.
Jack is just like all great producers, just like Chet. He gets what he considers a great song in a great studio with a great artist that he respects and really the best musicians you can find, and then he just kind of shuts up and lets them do it.
But he heard us a different way, and he had ideas of what kind of music we should do and pick the songs and kind of guided us to go in that direction. And we almost pulled off some pop hits there.
Wrote one called California Girl in Tennessee Square, and that one did real well. And then we followed it up with another California song called Wicked California. And I did an album or two with it.
They were a little edgier material, you know, getting into subjects and things that they, not, other than just straight love song.
California Girl was kind of a California production type of thing. It had strings on it, and it was pretty uptown.
I was always an experimental kind of producer. I never did just go cut something like everybody else. I just always wanted to do something different. Not so much country, hillbilly. I like hillbilly music, you know. That's what I call it. I prefer to call it shit kicking, but you can't always use that in public.
The great songs that they did with Jack and great records they cut.
He cut some of their best records, I think.
Without a doubt, I think it changed the way we thought of ourselves and what we did from that point on, too.
Nominated for the CMA Group of the Year so many years, and that they did actually win it.
I think they were the vocal group of the decade in the 70s. I think they got an award for that.
They had some hit records, and they had a very successful publishing company, too.
We didn't feel that we were getting the promotional support from the record labels that we should, and so Chuck said, we need to start our own publishing company. We'll have that money to help promote ourselves. So he was kind of responsible for starting the publishing company and ultimately wanting to build a studio, and Tom Paul was working on putting more artist-friendly things in contracts.
They worked with a lot of people who would come in from out of town who wanted to cut a record.
And I think the Glazers were really into what they did. They took it that seriously. But if you came in there and you had some ideas, you had crazy ideas or crazy clothes, that didn't stop the Glazers.
They didn't have a studio in the building at 801 16th Avenue South. That's where I worked with them. We would go elsewhere. We'd usually go to Owen Bradley's studios to cut demos or masters.
They had crazy people coming in with wild ideas and song lyrics. People who were not part of the good old boy network, not part of the Nashville sound.
We were doing what we had to do and trying to get things cut, making sure they were copywritten, and all of that had to be done by hand.
Through the Glazers Association, I met everybody in town. I'd pick up the phone and call whoever was Bill Holmes with Glaser Publishing, come on over.
Chuck handled the major business, registration, copyrights, this type of thing. And he pitched the songs. Jim worked mostly in marketing, the artist management part of it too. Tom Paul was not always around. He'd make things happen, but from meetings and getting together with people. He didn't stay in the office too much when I was there.
They published John Hartford's song, Gentle on the Mind, which was Song of the Year.
John Hartford's greatest gift, of course, was as a writer. And he looked at things differently than anybody else.
Chuck, I have to say, was probably the mainstay there. He believed in John and tirelessly promoted him.
I think he kind of saw and recognized the genius that, that was in the song and that John Hartford had.
Chuck immediately saw that there was something there, and he said, let's get a demo over it first, and then I want to go show this to Chet Atkins. And on the strength of that song, RCA actually signed John to a contract.
He had pitched it around over 100 times, he said, before Glenn Campbell agreed to cut it and have his big hit on it.
John did win a Grammy for it himself, but Glenn brought the money in, I think, probably.
I think that's still the highest played recording in BMI's history.
They had that in Woman Woman the same year as publishers. And so that was a big contribution to the pop music industry.
This has become my favorite over the years, and it must have been one of yours, because initially it sold 1.5 million copies. Pretty darn good, I thought. Wow. You know what I found out years later? It's on its way to 16 million. I'm not sure. You guys probably did it all yourselves, didn't you?
One night at the Opry, I was in a dressing room. We'd just finished our spot. Mel Tillis came walking in with his guitar and said, I want you to hear a song that I just wrote. And I said, great, because he's a great writer. And he sang, Ruby, Don't Take Your Love to Town. There was an old bluegrass song called Ruby, Ruby, and every time he got to that old Ruby, my mind wandered over to the bluegrass song, and I thought, on the way home from the Opry that night, I thought, I wish he hadn't have done that way, you know. It might keep it from being a hit. So I pulled over to the side of the road and I thought, what about writing a song when you think your woman is cheating where you don't say her name, you just say woman. And I wrote the last verse of Woman, Woman, as it is today, and wrote it down on an old envelope and pitched it in a drawer. And a few months later, when Jimmy Payne was looking for material, we dug it out and finished it.
I just fell in love with the way that he sung directly to her and called her woman. You know, I thought that sounded really folksy. And so we wrote on that song all night, came out with a finished song.
I remember a songwriter, we played it for him not long after we'd written it. He said, you can't have cheating in a rock song. You should change that to leaving. Woman, woman, have you got leaving on your mind? So it was kind of a neat feeling when it hit, even with the word cheating in it, you know.
And so I went ahead and recorded Woman, Woman. And we put it out, and my record was playing in Los Angeles, and Jerry Fuller, who produces for Columbia Records out there, had just signed Gary Puckett and the Union Gap to a contract and said, I've got a song I want you to record.
Jerry didn't believe it was going to be a hit as a country record, but he had his mind going in a pop mode, and he said, I'm going to find a singer and I'm going to record this song.
I remember the morning when a license came across our desk down at the publishing company that from Columbia Records, where Woman, Woman had been recorded by the Union Gap, and we'd never heard of them. Of course, we called over to the Columbia's office and said, what's a Union Gap? And they said, we don't know either, tee-hee-hee. And then it hit.
I honestly don't remember thinking to myself, gee whiz, I think we've got a hit on our hands. But suddenly when I saw people smile and light up when they heard it, you know, I thought, well, maybe there's something more going on here than I realized.
I was a little irritated with it at first because we were still trying to break my record, but it was so big that it was more forgiving, you know, as it approached the top of the charts.
I believe about 1.5 million records went across the counter for Woman, Woman.
And it actually was certified gold by the time it got to the top 10. And it sold nearly another 1 million on the way out of the chart.
There's something that happens when you go out and you sing Woman, Woman to 5,000, 10,000, 500. They love it. It's hard to imagine what the future would have been like if Woman, Woman was not a hit, because it started a great wave, you know, and we were able to ride the crest of that wave with Young Girl, Lady Willpower, and Over You, especially through 1968, and in fact were the #1 record-selling artist of that year.
I remember Chuck saying, we need to build a studio. We got to have a place to demo songs. And when he started talking about how much money it would cost, I thought, this is bizarre.
And then we bought Glaser Publishing and Studio over on 19th Avenue. And I was an ex-carpenter in St. Louis, so I put up the shutters on the windows, and we saved hundreds of dollars in insurance.
By then we were managing a photographer who was shooting a lot of the album covers in Nashville, you know. We had a promotion department, and we're big business.
And plus, they were smart people. They were running a multi-million-dollar publishing company. They had attorneys that advised them on things, and they were very knowledgeable because they'd been in the music business for probably 10 or 15 years at that time themselves.
It actually started out as a little demo studio that Chuck had put together with borrowed, you know, used material, Ampex equipment and things like that, and then it just kind of blossomed into this high-tech studio that became famous as the place to go if you wanted to really be creative and do your own thing.
I mean, if you go to Music Row today, you won't find a studio like the Glazers that a stranger could walk into or somebody could walk into that's open, that has people recording songs that take half an hour in length or 12 minutes, or, you know, they're not doing this for radio or for a record company. They're doing it more for art's sake.
It really kind of took off as a place that was innovative.
In our studio, we had our engineer put a little radio transmitter that would reach about 100 feet. And after we mixed a song, we'd go down and sit in our cars and listen to the radio that we were used to listening to current commercial music in and see what it sounded like. And it's kind of an amazing thing, you know. Suddenly the bass isn't there, and you know you got to boost it in a higher frequency because you got a little tiny speaker in the car. It was great. Those are the kind of things we were trying to make happen.
I cut several things over there. I did an album with Waylon there, Dreaming My Dreams. He always said it was his favorite.
Well, there's a lot of action in that studio. I think Tom P. used to hang out there a lot.
It was wild and woolly. You just never knew who would be there, what would be going on.
Didn't seem to be too many rules, you know. You didn't know who was in control there. I'd assume Tom Paul was.
June, who ultimately married Tom Paul, really was the sort of glue. She was the bookkeeper, and she was Tom Paul's secretary, and if you had a problem, you could find June and explain it to her, and she would try to get it done.
I dropped by to see Tom Paul. He had a big office down on the first floor, and Waylon was involved in it. He had her office there.
They wanted everybody to be their own person. They allowed us freedom as musicians. I don't remember being told much what to do when we played.
It was a friendship thing. Everybody that worked together, they weren't employees. There were no employees. And they came together with their ideas, and for the first time they could do whatever they wanted. There were no big companies involved.
They liked the idea of just letting people do whatever it is they do.
That's the fun of the business, to be creative, you know, and bring the artist to another level and make that song identifiable with them.
When we do a recording session, they wanted the creativity that anybody could bring to it. So if I played something they liked, they let me have the freedom to play it.
They were really pretty generous and adventurous people when it came to who they'd let in the door around there.
They had crazy people coming in with wild ideas and song lyrics. People who were not part of the good old boy network, not part of the Nashville sound.
That was one of the beauties of the Glaser studio is that they had a pretty open policy. A lot of weird stuff came through the door, but an awful lot of really cool stuff came through there too.
People from New York would come down and they'd go straight, they wouldn't go to the record companies, they'd go to Glaser Studios to see what was happening.
Going back to before I started working there, in 1969, when I was hanging around the studio, one of the very first things I got to see was a project that Claude Hill was engineering, and it was John Hartford. And they were doing an album it's called Aeroplane. And it's a, legendary, groundbreaking record.
I guess they were pretty much their own producers because I don't remember anybody else being there calling the shots. It was usually Jim ran the recording sessions.
They weren't the greatest record sellers in the world, but it wasn't because of lack of talent, because they were brilliant.
We were having trouble getting high chart records, and I remember since I was in promotion, I asked B.J. McElwee, who was promotion man for MGM Records at the time, what was wrong? How come our records weren't doing better? And he said, you're doing the wrong kind of material. Everybody has an idea. And he said, get one of those songs that's been a pop hit and cover it country. So he called one day and said, there's this new record out by a group called Calgary Stampede called Rings. That's the one you guys ought to do. He said, now get a fiddle player and a steel guitar and go in there and just let those musicians honk all the way through it. So we did. Took them up to our studio and recorded it, and it was a really good record for us.
Most of the stuff they cut were either their own songs or songs that they had their songwriters wrote for them. And that was one of their ways to get around and outside the music city machine to where the labels controlled every bit of what you produced.
They did the artwork for the album cover. They decided what pictures was going to be on it. The final mixing, the mastering was done in New York. They told you what studio to record at. And those were the battles that Tom Paul was trying to win, and Chuck too.
My dad then decided that what he would do was their songwriters will help them get label deals. And and put out records, and so they'd have another source of income.
When I recorded for Epic, which was part of Columbia, I remember one of the first things Chuck, who produced that album, asked me was, who do you want to play on this album? And he never said anything about, I think you ought to use this song or that song. But I didn't realize until later how unusual that was.
They had a very independent studio, and they took crazy risk on guys like me.
That was part of their organization, was not just to get their songwriters the songs and get them published and get them cut, but to then have them create their own careers as well.
I like to think that I play country music with a conscience, with a social conscience, and I think the Glaser Brothers were the first ones who let me do that.
Chuck did amazing stuff and Jim did amazing stuff, but somehow Tom Paul was really kind of the magnet.
His job was to promote the brothers within the industry. He was the CMA for a while. He worked very closely with Francis Preston and BMI. He was very heavily involved in that business side, whereas my dad ran the day-to-day publishing and really worked diligently to promote their songwriters.
I worked with the photographers and I worked on the layout and things in that nature, but quite frankly, had it not been for what battles they were already doing, I'd probably still be singing in vocal groups somewhere. You know, I mean, I really know that's true about myself. I admire so much what they did and their vision and their drive and their desire to make that happen.
Tom Paul was kind of the brooding soul of the whole place. I mean, Tom Paul was really, really could see a bigger picture.
He really was for the underdog, and he really was on the outside looking in. He had that attitude. That's real important. Once you're on the inside, you don't do any good. Once you're happy, you create nothing great.
Tom Paul had a very shy side to him. I guess I always felt that was kind of the bravado Tom Paul, the face he put on when he didn't want to be the shy Tom Paul anymore. It was just the name he gave himself, you know? It was just the great Tom Paul, you know?
Tom Paul is, in my opinion, one of the greatest country singers to ever hit Nashville. Never had the stardom or the recognition that he should have.
Tom Paul had a voice like he could have been, if he'd been an actor, you know, he'd have been Richard Burton.
Nobody does, vocals like he does, It's just like he's got this great country, smooth voice.
And great songwriter. God, he wrote some songs that I just love. Very, very, very talented man.
One of my biggest hits was Streets of Baltimore, and Tom Paul and Harlan Howard wrote it.
When he was a little boy and could pick up the guitar and sing, and he seemed to know every song that he ever heard. He loved doing that, and if he was going to have to be punished, it was taking the guitar away from him. So it was just such a part of his life.
Just about everything he did musically is excellent.
Tom was a very good-looking young man, wavy black hair, and the girls loved him.
I used to stand back there and play bass, and he'd be on, and I'd just be in awe. He had the soul.
On the days that I was in the studio with him when he was sort of focused and centered, you couldn't ask for a better singer.
I mean, he had that kind of thing in his voice, beautiful voice. He probably could have sung opera,
I think the memories I have of him, the ones I'm most proud of, are those times when the lawyers here or in New York would ask for his opinion of something, and he was a self-taught legal mind. And I was very proud of him for that.
Tom was always a good businessman.
I remember Tom Paul in New York. He was great. I mean, he was never intimidated by New York.
He was a good guy to work for, and work with.
One of the most unusual guys I've ever known in my life, and a very influential person in my life, at least.
I haven't talked to him in a long time. Tom Paul's been pretty well, at home. And he doesn't seem to want visitors, but I really miss him.
I saw him someplace one day, and we kidded around for a while and laughed and talked about some old times and how much fun we used to have and stuff like that, and how much we missed the good old days,
He was a character. He was joking. He was always telling something funny.
They were cutting a John D. Loudermilk song, and John was there, and he had these real thick glasses, and somebody said Tom Paul walked up and licked both of his frames of his glasses, and he couldn't see, you know. But I heard that he was quite a jokester back in those days.
I was in a restaurant one night, and he just, for no reason at all, he dropped down on one knee and started serenading the waitress.
Always had fun hanging out with Tom Paul. We'd argue and talk and pick and sing, but it was fun.
Tom Paul was in character 24 hours a day. He wasn't one of these guys that plays golf with the studio executives in the afternoon and then puts on vampire makeup at night and does his show.
There was flamboyance, but there was very little shuck and jive in that. He wasn't trying to act like something he wasn't. And that way you could trust him. You knew that whatever you were listening to, good, bad, or ugly, was an honest thing there.
Tom Paul was always a problem for different people. He never was a problem to me. I always kind of liked him. He tried hard, I guess. I don't know. He was always ready to fight.
I think he liked to stir things up. I think that's his personality.
He had a reputation of being a very difficult guy to get along with. And more than once he lived up to that reputation.
Oh, he was just a rebel, I think. He was just an innovator.
I think that's why we became friends, you know. I love the guy.
He and I got to be, I think, very good friends, very close. We spent a lot of time hanging out together, and we would fight all the time. But the thing that was kind of interesting about Tom Paul to me was each day was a brand new day. I kind of liked that. You let off steam and you didn't have to worry about it. And for every time we went out and got in an argument, there were 10 times that we just went out and had a great time laughing. You know, he's a very, very funny guy.
He had an idea of where he wanted to go, and nothing got in the way of that. I mean, whereas I suppose I didn't have that same dream when I was young. I was following him.
Tom Paul was way ahead of the game when it came to artists' rights and taking control of the creative process and encouraging people to do what was in their heart and in their soul. And I think he really had a lot of empathy for real artists.
When we got to the point where we had deals with record labels and begin to see how the way the business was at that time was affecting our careers, then both he and Chuck started trying to change those things.
There are two Tom Pauls. You know, there's the Tom Paul persona, and then there's the Tom Glaser.
I think he might have been conflicted a little bit about being the wild man and still have a little bit of that altar boy living inside of him.
He kind of orchestrated his own drama. Why he did those things, I don't know, but he seemed to be very amused by that.
He's got this, you know, this bravado thing that he likes to do, and that he's ornery, and you know, he has no friends, and like his song, one of the songs he wrote, you know, I'm a bad, bad, bad cowboy. He was just kind of built that way. That was just his makeup. His makeup was different from the other two boys.
I ran into him one time at a little place over in West End called, it was at the time it was called Bishop's Pub, and he was back in the back room playing pool, and I introduced myself to him, and he didn't like the fact that I interrupted his pool game, so we kind of left it at that.
We would walk in bars and people would get up and leave, and he'd go, well, I cleared out another one.
He wants people to think that he's, you know, the meanest, orneriest guy around. But you get him on his own, and he's Tom. He's Tommy. He's the soft, gentle man. He doesn't let very many people see that side.
He was always a perfect gentleman that his mama raised him to be, at least when he was around me.
Tom Paul's not only a brilliant guy, he's a good guy. He's a good man. But he's just hard to get along with. And he knew it. I mean, there was never any doubt. Probably dozens and dozens of times I'd ride around with him, and he'd be steering with his knees. He'd get his knees. Everybody that knew him knows this routine. He would steer, and he'd be singing and playing an ukulele. He would be singing, "Oh, Tom Paul, "Oh, Tom Paul, thou art the great asshole," to the tune of "Old Christmas Tree." So it wasn't like he didn't know.
When I dream now about the brothers, he is always the Tom Paul from the early 60s or from the farm. The Tom Paul who was shy and quiet.
He was sort of a pussycat in outlaw clothing. He was a softy inside. He had a soft place. He had a good heart.
You know, you don't want too much sugar in your cornflakes anyway.
Some people, when you walk in a room, their eyes light up, and Tom Paul was one of those for me. My dad was that way. He was the only one in my family. When I walked in a room, his eyes just lit up. And those are the people we love. I guess because they love us. Maybe he loved me, I don't know. But I loved him, and I know when I walked in a room, his eyes lit up. So I love Tom Paul Glaser.
There's not many significant people. And I think the great Tom Paul might have been one of them. And he was there very early on with it. I think a lot of people subconsciously took their cues from Tom. So I think he was a great one.
I think if you talk to young artists today, they almost to a person, particularly the male artists, will tell you that Waylon Willie and Tom Paul and these outlaw figures were their formative influences.
Tom Paul was actually a forerunner in that type of sound and that type of music.
There's always been outlaws. Hank Williams, for one, was probably the greatest and the biggest one, the outlaw of his time.
I think that all of the young rebels of today recognize the outlaws that went before them. They may not know Tom Paul's name, but they certainly know Waylon's name. No Tom Paul, though, no Waylon either, because the whole thing was bound together.
Tom Paul had an often underrated influence on Waylon.
Tom Paul wanted to produce his own records. That was not really something that happened very often back in those days. Waylon wanted to do his own thing. Waylon broke away from the RCA system and came to Tom Paul's to do that. That was where he launched his independent career.
Here's this guy's a major RCA Victor recording artist, and he was saying, I want to pick my own material, I want to pick my musician, I want to produce this thing. None of that had ever been done in Nashville by a major artist.
By the 1970s, a lot of the younger artists felt that the Nashville sound was getting to be more like a factory system, and they wanted to take control of their music. They wanted to record with their own bands and have their own sound and not have the outsider producer telling you what to do and what songs to sing.
And the Glazers were operating at a time, believe me, that was the worst of the Nashville sound era.
The way it worked was you had an A&R guy, that you had an arranger, you had a producer. They all had their job, and you were the talent.
Tom Paul knew that what was going on was not right, that they shouldn't be controlled by somebody else, you know. So that's how the whole thing got started. And he became angry about it, I guess, and decided to do something about it. Nobody else was going to do something about it. He was.
You know, he said, we're not going to sing anymore. We're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to be on the opera anymore.
He was just a person who didn't care what people thought. You know, he knew what he wanted and knew what should be and knew that they were wrong about the way they run things. And he stood his ground.
He was living in a time and in a situation that was revolutionary. I mean, it was a time when big companies were starting to come into fruition, but those sort of small enclaves also had a lot of reach and a lot of meaning too. And Tom Paul's place was one of those places where people were paying attention. But it was also where artists were starting to take more control of the whole creative process.
They wanted to play their own music. That's all they wanted to do, was do it their way. Walk their own road. And the older you get, walking your own road becomes more and more and more important, because nobody got to be old or successful by walking another man's road.
We believed that we were as good musicians and singers and talents as anybody that was called pop, and that we ought to be an industry unto ourselves, and we should have the ability allowed to us by the record companies to sell 1 million records if we reached 1 million people that wanted to buy them.
I mean, that was the problem. You had a studio system that had been in place since the 1940s, and it was a very important thing. Nashville probably wouldn't have even been famous if it wasn't for the studio system. but it kind of outlived its usefulness.
Because of this willingness and wanting to take control of their own productions, these people were soon dubbed outlaws. And ironically enough, it came from Tom Paul Glaser's studio, because Hazel Smith worked there, and a radio station asked her what to call the music, and she said outlaw.
I knew that it had to have a name or a title. Everything does for it to amount to anything. So when I looked up the word outlaw and it said living on the outside of the written law, I said, that's what they're doing.
Hazel's one of those people that seems like she was just there, always there. She was an observer. She's a brilliant sort of journalist. She wrote for magazines and things like that and did publicity and stuff. So she was looking for a story, but that was the perfect place to find one.
We're all like dogs. We're like dogs running courses. And they'll say, well, the poodle's the smartest breed. Well, the poodle's not the smartest breed. Some of the others are pretty hip too. They just don't want to do that shit, you know? They don't want to do tricks for you. So the outlaws didn't want to do tricks.
They're just people that wanted to make it more earthy, I guess. And there's more variety in it.
And the impetus to a lot of it was this little studio over there at 916 19th Avenue South that had this reputation of this is where you can go and you can sing anything, do anything, bring any guys in there any way you want to. And that's what it's all about. It's the antithesis of the old studio system.
So Tom Paul brought Waylon in, and Willie Nelson produced it. I wasn't even told what was happening. Tom Paul said, Waylon's coming in. 6 o'clock that night, Waylon and his whole band showed up, and it's like, we're going to record. And so they started recording a record on Monday night, I think, and by the end of the week, it was done. And it garnered his first #1 record, and I think it sold really well. I guess it was maybe a gold album or something at that point.
All of us that relied on an established music industry couldn't understand why somebody wanted to change it. I think that was generally the feeling that why can't they be happy the way it was?
You've got to go along with the Opry, you've got to go along with the producers, you've got to go along with the music business. If you don't, it won't go along with you.
Nashville resisted the Outlaws, but you know what they did? Country music had always been by and for adults. And now, with these new long hair artists, they attracted for the first time a youth audience to country music, and that was the key to it all. And really, Nashville owes those artists a great deal of gratitude for doing that, because for the first time, country had youth appeal. After Hazel Smith came up with the little moniker outlaw to define the new sound, that's when it became a marketable thing. And so the executives at RCA Records, Jerry Bradley, decided to make an album called Wanted the Outlaws, because they had in their vaults at RCA recordings by Jesse Coulter, Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, and Tom Paul Glaser.
This was the beginning of, Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings' career, and Tom Paul's his solo career, and the whole outlaw thing. And these were people who used to gather around the studio. When their career's starting to take off, Dad's starting to book those people into various different venues and come up with the Outlaw Music Festival featuring, Waylon and Willie and Tom Paul and Jesse Coulter. Dad was instrumental in going to RCA and convincing them to do a compilation. His idea was to do it to help promote his concert series, the Outlaw Music Festival.
And they packaged those 4 artists together, made an old-time Wanted poster for the front of the jacket, and Wanted the Outlaws with those 4 key artists became the first platinum-selling record in the history of country music.
It was a time when artists, because of that record, they were getting control of their music. People weren't telling them how to make their records. They were making the records like they wanted to, and it was becoming commercially successful.
Well, you could argue that there are still outlaws being made today. I mean, look at Jamie Johnson. There are still people that break the mold in Nashville to this day, only now you can do that and be accepted, which is great.
Hillbilly Central, that Glaser Studios, that was the springboard.
It was fun. You'd see You know, people were coming and going. It was, you know, 3-act play, drama.
That's where most people hung out. If it wasn't my office, it was the Glaser studio.
Captain Midnight was there, who was fascinating. Somebody should write a book about Roger Scott. Nobody called him Roger. Everybody called him Midnight.
He lived at the Glaser Brothers studios for many months, years. That's where you'd find Midnight.
I never was sure what he did. He was just a great guy, always over there.
The first that I know about Midnight was that he was a really successful pop DJ in Nashville in the 60s. He was a big deal radio DJ. He was also brilliant. I mean, he was really funny, really smart. He was one of those guys that could sum up any situation almost instantly.
You know, he was funny, very, very funny. He could certainly make you laugh.
But he ended up sort of being, I don't know, sort of a court jester around there. He just kind of hung out. He lived in one of the offices downstairs.
It was kind of like a hummingbird. I mean, he'd eat these packs of sugar, these little things from restaurants, and wear this bandana that he'd put over his eyes and lay down on the couch and go to sleep.
Waylon and Tom Paul liked him, and you know, at the same time they sort of hated him. They, you know, because he would not suffer them. He would say whatever the reality of the situation was. But Midnight got into knife throwing in the backyard and had this big wooden board out there with about 10 million holes in it where he was practicing throwing his knife and stuff. Or it could be bullet holes. Might not be knife. There were a few, you know, firearms that showed up from time to time around there.
Captain Midnight was the main knife thrower. But Tom, Paul, Waylon, all of us, I even threw a few knives, but they'd go back in that gravel parking lot and be throwing knives against this target.
I was kind of a little bit leery of the knife thing because if you didn't throw them right, they would bounce and come back at you. You know, you hit handle first, so I left most of that up to Cap.
I think he played a lot of pinball too, so that was lots of pinball getting played around those days at the Burger Boy.
I have been on many long pinball jags with Tom Paul.
It was just sort of like a rolling party at its best. It meant going from bar to bar, honky-tonk to honky-tonk, and pinball parlor to pinball parlor for from 36 hours to 48 hours straight.
Now the only difference was Tom Paul was taking them stay-awake pills, and I couldn't do that. And he'd outlast me.
I imagine if they took all the wall panels down or the drywall down or whatever in that recording studio, they might be surprised at what they would find.
And this was a cast of characters, folks, that is not like your run-of-the-mill bunch.
There was me, and I'm not the sanest person in the world, and then of course there was Waylon, and he was beating his brains out, and it was pretty nutsy around there.
Very much so. A country Fellini film.
When Hook came through, that was because of the Shel Silverstein connection. Shel had written a lot of the Dr. Hook hits. Shel came into the studio about 1973, and Tom Paul really liked Shel, and he said, "Hey Kyle, Shel wants to come in and do some demos." That he's going to come in and do some demos turned into 128 demos that we did over a number of years, where he would come in and book musicians and just demo songs that he had written. He was incredibly prolific.
Grand Funk Railroad recorded there. You could bring around that.
There's nothing wrong with the outlaw movement's ideas. Look at some of the best music came out of that era.
They were a little more edgy and, you know, not conforming to the typical songs and music that was being produced then.
They were very friendly there towards any kind of cause.
That studio now is Compass Records, which is a very together, happening organization. All kinds of things going.
I laugh every time I go over there because they've got young children and they try to make them be part of their lives, so they don't leave them at home. They have a little daycare room for these kids to play in with cute little plastic toys.
And I went, wow, you got all the bloodstains out of here. All the broken glass and the booze bottles and fist holes in the wall. And it's all gone, and cleaned it all up. But it's still an independent studio, which made me feel good.
And every time I look at that, I can see Tom Paul's desk and all the things we were doing in there. You know, but it was about music. It was just about music.
The idea of being independent in music and in politics is real important.
It's moved on to the next transition of what it was back in those days, which is a place where people can go and feel comfortable about doing their own thing, and that's probably maybe as good as any legacy for the Glaser Brothers.
Chuck was just very easy to get along with.
He never got upset about things, and he just really a super nice guy.
He was always solid. He wasn't as affected by the business probably as I may have been or Tom Paul may have been.
Chuck has written a lot of songs, and a lot of people don't know that, but he had written some really great material, had some recorded overseas.
Chuck wasn't as music driven, I don't think, as I was, and certainly not as much as Tom Paul was. I respect so much the things he did even after his stroke, things that I can't really identify with because his drive was in an area that mine wasn't.
Chuck was probably the best businessman of the three of them. And there again, I only say that because I was with his booking agent and I got to see him firsthand from a business side.
He was kind of the publishing brain. I mean, I think Chuck is the one who found John Hartford. Chuck was always out looking for interesting Kinky Friedman. Chuck brought Kinky Friedman and the Texas Jew Boys in there. It was fantastic, you know, crazy stuff.
Chuck and I had a very good relationship. He produced the record Sold American, which, along with Honky Tonk Heroes by Billy Joe Shaver that Waylon recorded, were probably early snowplows for the whole outlaw movement.
I think his greatest gift in the music business was his ability to maybe recognize talent or creativity where other people might not have recognized.
We sent in some tapes, and one only came back from Glaser Publication, Nashville, Tennessee. It was from Chuck Glaser, who I didn't know at the time, but learned later was one of the few, very few, maybe the only major publisher, at least in Nashville, that even deigned to look at over the transom material.
You know, the day he had his stroke when he was 39, which was very young, that was the day that they had signed the papers to sell their publishing company. And he was the one who didn't want to sell it. You know, Jim and Tom Paul did. So that was something that really had hurt him quite a bit on that. And I don't know exactly where he was, but it was after he signed the papers, he was pulling out in his car, you know, backing up, and that's when he had the stroke.
It was a terrible shock, and I remember Mom and Dad flew down there. They didn't expect him to live. He kind of lost the use of his left hand, and he worked hard to get some of that back again, although I never could play the guitar again.
The thing I remember vividly was his 40th birthday, which was in February, and he had it in the hospital. He had just come out of the coma. They had done surgery on him, and so what I remember as a vigorous man playing softball with him, and him playing guitar and singing to someone slumped in a wheelchair being pushed into the cafeteria in the hospital to celebrate his birthday in the hospital, and that was a shock. It was obviously hard on the entire family because he was always the the breadwinner and the person on the go and always gone. Then he was home all the time and was dependent on us to do things, and also Mom, was very dependent on Mom. It probably took him a good 5 years before he really started to move back into the music industry and recovering. A 5-year lag is a long time in that industry.
to kind of be out, so he had to really start over.
He made such a tremendous comeback. I think his comeback and his determination to overcome should be an inspiration to everybody.
He isn't somebody to give up, that's for sure.
It didn't come back by magic. He worked at it every day.
And his mental attitude through it, he never seemed to be down in the dumps about it. He always seemed to be accepting of what had happened to him and working through it.
His philosophy, and you told me this many years ago, was if there was a problem, a wall in front of you, first you tried to go through it, then you tried to go over it, and then you tried to go around it, but even if you couldn't go around it, you tried to bust down the wall.
He put up with so many things with that stroke and the side effects of it that I don't think I ever truly appreciated what he was doing. We'd go on the road then, and I'd started running in '79, so we'd get to a place and check in, and the band would go over to set up, and I'd go out and run 4 miles, and I'd be coming back, and there would be Chuck out there doing his 3 or 4 miles. He couldn't move his left leg much, and it was really, really amazing. I would be thinking, boy, I've got some dedication here to be after riding the bus all night to go out running, and there would be Chuck. And I thought, well, now that's really what discipline is right there.
It's the way he's approached every challenge in his life. He didn't want to, he didn't like to be defeated without trying to do his best.
Dad's always been a very religious person and always had a very strong faith. So I think that's it. I think it's his faith and my mom's faith. And, his determination just to succeed. And it probably also, him having 6 kids probably had a lot to do with it also.
To see him now when his attitude is still so up and positive, and Beverly's too, that's an inspiration right there.
What it really speaks to me is what a rock his wife Beverly has been.
It was very much her strength and her will to get him to the doctors in that early part, especially before he could do things for himself.
I admire her probably as much as any woman I've ever known. She's an incredible, incredible lady, so strong.
I think his greatest gift that has sustained him throughout his entire life is his determination, and his faith.
He's very devoted. He is religious, reads and prays a lot, and I'm guessing he just takes his faith and has never questioned it.
I can see that determination to succeed or to just do what you set your mind out to do.
If you were to look at any of the 3 Glaser brothers, it would certainly be Jim, who you would have to point to as having the successful solo career.
Oh, Jim Glaser is one of the greatest. He always had a good attitude, was real sweet about everything.
Jim was a great writer and he's, of the 3 of them, was the most musically gifted in terms of really knowing what he was doing and understood all the theory and the harmony, and he would, really help with all that stuff. And he had, he just really got it.
He was very good at second tenor and first tenor, singing harmony parts.
When you sit and listen to the high parts in El Paso and you go, wow, man, the boy could sing.
Jim sang harmony on some of the stuff that I recorded. I can't remember which ones right now, but Jim was a great high tenor harmony singer.
Did a lot of backup as a tenor, just putting tenor on, and with the Jordanaires and the Anita Kerrs and the Nashville edition, the stuff. I really enjoyed doing that.
I thought I could write probably before I came to Nashville, but it took writing with Jim to polish. I don't think he knew he was teaching me.
I think Jim was probably the most influential one in there, musically and everything. He seemed to me to be the more astute one when it came to actual musicianship.
Well, Jim was real competitive. We would go out and shoot pool before we would write, and I think it's that competitive edge that just kept him going.
Oddly, when I was a kid growing up in Nebraska, Chet Atkins was my idol. I wasn't at first really that enamored with the thought of being a singer, and then I heard Hank Snow sing and just fell in love with him, and and started trying to copy him. Of course, he was a baritone, I was a tenor, so it was hard to tell that I was copying Hank. One night about 2 o'clock in the morning, I guess, Tom Paul called me and said, "Hey, I'm over at Hank Snow's house." Now, Hank Snow lived just right down the street from me out in Madison. And he said, "Come over here and sing him some of his songs." Now, I'd been asleep, but hey, I got up and went down and went in his house, and he handed me a guitar, and I started singing him his old records. And he just loved it. It was the coolest memory. It really was. Actually, I was offered deals before I really had any interest in doing it. Chet Atkins, I guess, had mentioned to Tom Paul that he thought I should record as a solo, and I hadn't really thought too much about it. I wrote a song called The Outcast. I'm the Outcast. And he got a pop pick in Billboard and was never heard of again, I don't think.
There's no one formula for having success in the music business, and you can just turn around and write another song or pick another song and go out and release it, and you never know, that one might be the one that hits.
The ex-wife of a country disc jockey that I'd met back when I was doing promotion called me and said, "Do you have a record deal?" And I said, "No, and I can't get one." And she said, "Send something to this guy." And so you do it. You send one to anybody. And I sent him a tape, and he called me and said, "Hey, I want to start a record label. I want you to be the artist." And that's how that happened, Noble Vision Records, and it was an independent label.
You know, I remember when my partner handed me the record that he had recorded on Jim when we first met, and told me he was looking for someone to help him out with getting a record out, and I listened to it. I went back to him and said, this sounds like a hit record. This is just a smash.
It took me a long time to discover with my own voice and how I sing what communicated to them the best. And I finally reached that to some extent on The Man in the Mirror.
We released 6 songs. You know, all of them went top 30 or higher. And then You're Getting to Me Again went #1. And that was 1984. I think we were the first independent record label in the country genre to go top 10 in the last decade at that time.
It was newsworthy. It was newsworthy that he had come from the group. It was newsworthy that he was having hits, and it was newsworthy that he was on a small, tiny label and having it.
So it was really something special, and we were all just thrilled to death. It was amazing.
That was the year I was Academy of Country Music most promising male vocalist, and I'll never forget, I came off the stage and some reporter shoved the mic in my face and said, "Hey, you're over 40 years old. You had a whole career with your brothers. What do you mean winning the most promising male vocalist?" And I said, "Well, I'm not giving it back."
What we decided to do was come to Nashville and get a distribution deal with a major label and have them help us finance this, because we already had a successful artist and one who had had hits. When the second album came out, the major label really wanted to do all the promotion, and they wanted to handle everything. They really wanted us just to concentrate on the artist and get the songs recorded and hand them a great record, and then they would promote it. We were all disappointed the second and third one didn't do what the first one did, but that's kind of the way it goes.
I thought that if I became a good enough singer, that the business would take care of itself. Well, that's a dumb move. You know, I should pay more attention to business. But it might have been that I was trying to do an opposite thing from what the brothers had done, concentrating so much on business.
Actually, when Jim had his first hit record with us, you know, he would still continue to travel with the Glaser Brothers, and as he started having more success, they'd let him kind of have a little show within their show. He'd just step up to the mic and they'd let him sing several songs solo. Once again, at some point, Jim went ahead and told him he was going to break off and start doing his own shows.
I had a record called The Lights of Albuquerque that was really trying to hit, and MCA kind of stepped on it. It upset me so much, and that record didn't hit. It died in the 40s or whatever, that I asked them to release me, and I thought, you know, I've had some good success here, I'll just go to another label. Well, this was the late 80s, and I started calling around and called Kyle Linning, who had worked in our studio as an engineer, and And Kyle said, man, I love your singing. I'd love to do some recording with you. He said, but quite frankly, we've been told by the Home Office not to sign anyone older than 26. And I was over 40. So here I was in the late 80s, and I couldn't get a deal. And I realized that I was looking at the end of my career, and I bought this 15 acres of land out in the woods and lived there from 93 to 2004. And the first 6 or 7 years, I mean, I was a hermit. I came out to buy food, and that was pretty much it. And a lot of time to think. A lot of the time in the woods was spent dealing with letting go of a passion and letting go of a dream and finding something else to live for and to think about and to be passionate about. And that's hard. The things I've faced in my own life and how I had become so obsessed with a career that I couldn't see my own family. And that was a mistake that I couldn't see. There was a reason for it, but no excuse for it, if you know what I mean. If there's a chance to say to people, don't let it become your whole life. You really have to have luck on your side, and you have to stay with it, and you have to be dedicated, and you have to be absorbed in it. But don't close your eyes to the people around you, you know. I don't think I'll ever love anything the way I love singing and performing still, but it's not the only thing in my life anymore. We were creatively moving in different directions.
I could see the split coming.
They fought like cats and dogs. I mean, as the years went on.
That's probably like all family squabbles, I guess. I've been in a few of those myself, too.
Well, they're brothers, you know. You know how that works.
They just knew each other so well, and they were all so talented. I guess that's got to cause some friction somewhere.
It's a tough, emotional way to make a living. And it takes a toll, and almost nobody ever gets out of it, you know, scot clean on these things, and there were no exception.
I guess they just didn't see eye to eye on everything.
The same reason the Everly Brothers broke up. They just argue and they fight. And that's the way it goes. And they have different views, and they have different things that started way, way, way back there when it probably is 3, 4, 5 years old.
There's conflicts. Why aren't we doing it this way? Why don't we do this instead? Or whatever. Maybe it's just because you cooped up with one another too long.
I think it's a lot of creativity. I think Tom Paul wanted to be not part of a group anymore. I think Jim wanted to be a solo artist.
I remember him telling about how when they would appear on stage, they would all come in separately, all dressed alike, and it really irritated them. I don't know why, but their minds were so together they couldn't even dress differently.
This is just like a lot of brothers that have to live and work together all the time, or anybody. You just grow apart after a while.
Well, I worked for Atlantic Records for a while as a staff producer, and Ahmet Ertegun always had a great saying, which he said he always hated signing bands because he said it was a group of musicians who were about to break up.
You know, the outlaw thing that Tom Paul eventually moved into and what Jim eventually moved into is totally opposite.
My tastes were always more in the direction of a real tight band and solid arrangements, and Tom Paul wanted the looser feel, and he would be apt to drop a strange song on stage in the middle of a set, which would annoy me no end when it happened, but I realized how many things that we had evolved into doing on stage that were the result of him starting into something that I could have strangled him for at the time, but later turned into a really important part of our show. That swapping off medley that we did was one of those things.
Jim and Tom Paul could change parts on stage, and if you weren't watching, you wouldn't be able to tell they did it, you know.
They would swap lines in a song and use the same microphone and bump each other out of the way. It was quite a show.
We worked a place up in Toronto and it was an afternoon show, and the only people that came to it looked like winos who were just looking for a place to sit, and there was no applause between numbers. And Tom Paul just got so tired of ending a song with no applause that he started singing every song he knew with no break. And when they got too high, I started coming in and singing it, and the winos woke up, you know. And we thought, hey, we're onto something.
And you could only know this if you saw him in person, because if you listened to him on the opera, you didn't. Why is the audience laughing? Because it sounds like one of them singing a song, Tom Paul, probably. Why the audience is laughing is because they had this three-part thing where all of a sudden Tom Paul would stop in the middle of a line and Jim had finished the line up, and then, except he'd stop before he got finished with the line and Chuck would be singing, and they do this all through the song, and it sounds like one voice instead of three guys singing. And you know, the crowd loved that.
I think it was showy too, the way they did it on one microphone. They could have easily done it on two mics, but it wouldn't have been the entertainment value that it was with one.
They just knew they couldn't do it as a group anymore, so they all branched out.
I think there's something inevitable about that. The egos and the desire to be creative and wanting to go in different directions.
Then the thing took on kind of Greek tragedy proportions, I think. It became kind of Shakespearean between the brothers.
The unfortunate thing is back in those days, there didn't seem to be a way to allow for a both-and kind of solution. You know, it's like you're either all into this or you're not.
Yeah, I was very surprised when the publishing company sold. I didn't think they would ever do that. I thought they would keep it as business partners, if nothing else.
I think the breaking up probably shattered some dreams. I really don't know where they really thought they were going to go. I guess I kind of wanted to stay out of it, not take sides. I love my brothers, each one, and I knew things weren't going well with them, that they hadn't been really happy together for quite a while.
It wasn't any one of us was not the one totally to blame. We were all blamed to some extent, and I just don't think it's fair for me to talk about their parts.
We would like to have had them get back together. We were happy when they did get back together, but that didn't work out either.
Chuck had a big motor home, and he'd had his stroke, and he was traveling a lot with his family, you know. He called Tom Paul and me and said, hey, let's all go back to Nebraska in that camper. And we did. That was cool.
Chuck was always trying to keep them together, always trying to keep them together as a family.
And we found out we could still do some things together, and as a result of that, we started the idea of working together and recording some again. Actually, we started working a little bit together in '79, but we started touring in '80, and we had some pretty good records. And we had most of the same musicians we'd had before, and in many ways it felt like we were taking up where we'd left off, reaching for that same elusive goal that we'd never quite gotten to.
Their recordings went right back up in the top 10, so their fans were happy to have them back together again.
After many years together making some great albums with impeccable harmonies, they broke up in 1973 to take up solo careers. However, they're now back together again and promise to do all the old favourites tonight. This, incidentally, is only their second public appearance together, and they're very nervous indeed. Let's meet them now, Tom Paul and the Glaser Brothers.
We first did that Wembley Festival in either '69 or '70.
And that was a big event. It was like 3 days of just constant music.
Even though they had done some shows before that, that was kind of like their debut of them getting back to the world.
There's a phenomenon there they call the Wembley Roar, and they usually only heard it at soccer matches or something. It's that big. But the people stomped their feet, and actually bits of plaster and things were falling off the ceiling. An amazing thing.
It was just like a big roar. When they really liked somebody, the people start stomping the floor.
We started to go off back to the dressing room, and this roar was happening, and they were trying to get us together to come back on. They told us before no encore.
Oh, it's great. I mean, they love them over that.
brother Kent and I caught wind that these things are being thrown out. And we drove over and started going through and salvaging what we could. A lot of the masters we pulled out, layouts from some of the albums, grabbed some of the pictures. Again, it's not very much. We didn't have very large cars. And we drove away once and came back the next day and it was already gone. Tom and Jim were at the top of the stairs outside, on the outside entrance to the studio, looking down and discussing whatever. I couldn't hear them, but just watching us pull things out. You know, at that point, not caring, but you know, look back now and they really wish they would have grabbed some of that stuff and not let it be tossed. You don't really think about history as you're living the history, and I don't really think they thought of it as history at that point. It's only been years later in their life that they think this is history. I think that's really the reason. They just saw it was junk.
Hank Snow was celebrating his 40th anniversary on the Opry, and he loved the Glazers and wanted us to play his 40th celebration, and so we got back together for that one night.
In Hillbilly Heaven, I'm sure they'll all be together.
After we'd been in Nashville for a few years, we were back home, actually in Omaha, and some guy in a restaurant just came over and he had recognized who we were, and he said, "How did you do it?" And we said, "What?" And he said, "How did you get from Spalding, Nebraska to Nashville, Tennessee?" And I never realized how that must seem odd to some people because it was always our dream. Looking back, it was quite extraordinary the way it did happen.
You know, the Country Music Hall of Fame, they, I guess, are trying to find the right people who fit different historical areas of country music. And I think the Glaser Brothers do fit that. I think they, you know, they weren't just an act who had commercial success. I think they were an act that contributed to the history of country music.
I do think they had a lasting effect on a lot of people, including myself.
Their contribution will go down. They should be in the Hall of Fame. Eventually they will be, I'm sure.
I was a lucky man to have ever met the three of those guys, and it's impossible to calculate how much I learned from that experience. It's one of the best things that ever happened to me.
You know, all three of them had successful solo careers, but I think the whole genius of what they were doing was, you know, the Glaser Brothers.
Think about the different qualities of all three of them. You put them together and it's really a masterpiece, and of business intellect as well as musical intellect.
Tom, Paul, and Jim together sounded good, but when you put Chuck in, that third part, it kind of just put the icing on the cake, so to speak. It made all the difference in the world.
They every now and then recorded with other people, like Hank Snow and Governor Jimmy Davis, and you could just hear the first ahs in the background. You knew it was the Glaser Brothers. They were just the greatest group.
And they came from a time when you had to win an audience, and you had to win them quick. They didn't have any smoke bombs, you know, or any kind of fancy stuff. They did it with their voices, and they did it with their smarts, and they did it by understanding who their audience was and how to entertain those people. And to think that they're not really all that well known or thought about, it's a shame.
I think maybe what the world needs to know is that these guys were very, very smart, very high achievers. They had some good hits, and they were a viable touring act for many years and did very well at it.
Well, what they really need is to hear some of those records that may have got lost in the shuffle. Those are some good stuff.
I really miss working with them, you know, because they were such great people and great artists.
They were quite successful in the publishing business. We had a kick-ass recording studio, and they were a brilliant trio. And that pretty much sums it up.
I think what I personally want to be remembered are those battles that Tom Paul and Chuck fought for back in the 60s when no one in country music had control of their own careers, and nobody else in town was fighting those battles.
I'll say for the Glazers, blessed is the match that kindles the flame. They've had an enormous influence.
They could very well have been maybe a really huge company that would still be going today. And maybe the reason it's not still there is it wasn't just about the money. You know, it was about fostering that kind of creative enclave. I think they just sort of demonstrated that it's possible. You know, it's possible for a small independent company to do big and important things.
It's wonderful to be part of country music, even peripherally. And I don't quite fit in, and I think that's good. And the only way I would have is if the Glazers had stayed in business.